Hi everyone, welcome to chapters 8 and 9. These are going to be combined because they were both a little bit shorter and they had similar content. So they've been combined into one lecture, and so you'll only need to do one reflection post, and the activities from this lecture will only be from this one for both 8 and 9, so you don't need to worry about double posting. So this week we are talking about interpersonal communication and cultural diversity and how we adapt to others. So let's talk briefly about culture shock, the idea of culture shock. I'd like you to take a moment and define what you think culture shock is. So the first thing that pops into your mind, if someone were to say, what is culture shock? What would you say? And then include 3 examples of what that may look like, either for yourself if you've experienced it, or for anyone that would be in a new culture. So once you have defined what that is and included 3 examples, I'll give you my version of what that is: feelings of stress and anxiety when a culture has little in common with your own. And so you can actually kind of compare what you thought about that with what I think, and some of that does come from the book, and then some of that is just kind of my interpretation as well. And so there's really no right or wrong, but it's definitely discomfort and lack of understanding with the culture that is dominant where you are. So if we consider the nature of culture and the role that that plays in our lives, culture in and of itself is a learned system of knowledge, behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, values, and norms that is shared by a group of people. And so let me look at each one of those individually quickly. So a learned system of knowledge. So it's information, it's things that we have learned and that we've absorbed through other people and through experiences. It's a learned system of behaviors. So there are certain ways that we respond and that we act out what we think and feel. It's a learned system of attitudes. And so it's the way that we perceive things, it's the way that we respond to things. Beliefs and values, those kind of go together, but it's what we think about the world and it's what we place importance on. And then norms. So this is what is expected if I'm a part of this culture. And all of that is shared by the group of people that considers that culture their own. So you can either write them down or just think of them briefly, but think of some of the cultures that you're aware of. And you define what culture means to you and list some cultures that you think fit that definition, that people that would have a learned system of those things that is shared. Okay, so now that we have a concept of what culture is, we have to keep in mind what co-culture is. And so when we think about co-cultures, we're talking about a distinct cultural group within the larger culture. And so if you think back to a couple of quizzes ago, we discussed in one of the quiz questions, where do terms come from? And the answer to that was co-culture. And some of you actually gave examples of what co-cultures might be. And so that's already been addressed in the multicultural aspects in some of the other things that we've talked about, but this is very specifically important to the interpersonal communication. If we need to adapt to cultures and co-cultures, we need to be aware of what those are. So now I'd like you to list some co-cultures that you can think of. And again, based on that definition, whatever pops into your mind, what are some of the co-cultures that you're aware of? Okay, so cultural elements. Cultural elements are things that identify aspects of cultural influence. And so basically what that's saying is, if you think about the things that feed cultural norms, influence cultural acceptance, what are those things? So we need to kind of break those down and identify what those elements may be. So material things and ideas, actual possessions. Every culture has very unique things associated with it. So the material possessions and ideas definitely are related to the culture. Social institutions as well. So schools, governments, religious organizations, all of those have cultural influence and have those cultural elements built into them. The belief systems, ideas about individuals and the universe. And so each culture is going to have a specific idea of what role an individual has, what purpose an individual has, and then on a larger scale, what role the universe has and what influence the universe has in life. And if you think about it, we'll actually get into that a little bit later, but if you think about it, Eastern and Western cultures have very different belief systems. So aesthetics is another cultural element. The way that one views music, theater, art, dance, all of those types of things. And so, if you think about interests in different cultures, the way that theater is expressed, the way that dance is expressed, very unique to culture. And anytime there's a traditional cultural celebration, whether that be Native American or Chinese with the dragons, or whatever, indigenous people that in the villages and tribes, they all incorporate dance and the arts and theater and music. If you think about all of those types of traditional indigenous festivals, they incorporate all of those things, and it's very specific and unique to their culture. So aesthetics is a big part of that. Language, of course, and we've spent a lot of time talking about verbal and nonverbal communication systems, so you should be pretty familiar with that. And then acculturation is capitalized because very, very crucial element to this. Acculturation is the process of acquiring new approaches, beliefs, and values by coming into contact with other cultures. And if you know anything about history, or I know you know about it, you've had to take it in school, but if you remember anything from history, that's the challenge sometimes. You are aware of a lot of the frustration with American culture is that we have forced acculturation, or there's a perception that Americans have forced acculturation on people, specifically the Native American Indians, Canadians, and any immigrants who we had issues with, especially, we placed a lot of Japanese Americans in internment camps during the war. And so, we have this value of acculturation. And it is that if you live in the United States, you need to acquire new approaches, beliefs, and values. And you do that by coming into contact with the American culture. And of course, that's not exclusive to America. That's anywhere you go. I mean, if I were to move to Kazakhstan, there would be an acculturation process that I would go through, because I would need to learn new approaches and beliefs and values. And the interesting thing is, it's very, very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to acculturate if you don't put yourself in contact with the culture. So if you choose to stay in your house and not learn the language and not interact and not get out and see the world and experience the world where you're now living, it's very, very difficult to acculturate. And actually, when I was growing up, there was a family 3 doors down, and they had children older than my brother and me, and their daughter babysat for us. But they were an Italian American family, and the mother was a stay-at-home mom because that's valued in other cultures. And so they made wine in their garage, and she cooked traditional Italian meals every day. And you could literally walk by the front of their home and you could smell the food. I mean, it was just like you knew that they always had good food at their house. Anyway, the point is, the husband ran a business, so he interacted with Americans all day, every day. So his English was very good. He understood American culture quite well. Their children were in American schools, so they learned English very well. They acculturated well. But because the wife, her name was Lena, because she lived in the home and never, aside going to the grocery store, she really didn't interact with many people. She still, to this day, they've lived in America for at least 40 years, and she still to this day struggles to speak English well. And so, again, that acculturation process, it needs to be a willful decision. It is something that just happens by nature of being in a new place to an extent. But if you truly want to experience acculturation, it has to be a purposeful decision that you make, that I'm going to be in contact with this other culture, and I'm going to let it change some of the ways that I think and some of the ways that I feel. So if we get specific to US culture, and I know some of you are not originally born in the United States, so I would be interested to hear your perspectives because, my only experience is American culture. So I'd love in the reflection posts if you are from another country or if you have grown up with parents from another culture or country, I would love to hear some differences. But if we think about US culture, what are some elements of US culture? What are stereotypical, and I know we try to avoid stereotypes, but in this instance it's okay. What are some stereotypical US or American cultural norms? What would you say are unique and specific to America? What about expectation for college education? I would say that at least in middle class families and higher, that is an expectation. And in the larger cities, it's more of an expectation. If you live in a very rural area and the area is not necessarily close to universities, or the jobs tend to be more skill-based, that may not be so true. But I think overarchingly, definitely in larger cities, higher populated areas with middle income families, we certainly expect children to go to college. What about freedom of expression? I think that is very, very unique to the United States. We have this rugged individualism that we value. And so part of that individualistic culture is we believe we have the freedom and the right to express certain things. And that's why we have amendments, and we have things like that in the Constitution to guarantee that we have those freedoms. A focus on relationships, and I think that you can argue that all cultures have relationships, and that's true. But I think that we are very relational people, and we express those relationships. So I think that is true of American culture as well. What about future and new technologies? I think there are some that would argue that Japan and China are taking over a little bit on that, but I think it's definitely a focus. I don't know that we are necessarily at the forefront of that race right now, but historically, America has been the home to the best entrepreneurs and the best engineering and inventors in the entire world. So I think that is certainly something that we can claim as our own. And I would also argue that the changing nature of family relationships is something that is a little bit unique to United States culture. Definitely the blended families concept. Many countries are still very traditional in their family roles and their family norms. And so the fact that we have, I think the latest statistics say that almost 70% of first marriages end in divorce. So if you think about that, 7 out of 10 people who've been married end up divorced. And so that often means that they're going to remarry later on down the road. That often means that they've had children with their first spouse, and then they're going to have more children with a spouse should they marry again. So blended families are very common in the United States, not so much in other parts of the world. And then even delayed marriage. I think what I read recently is that I want to say the average age for women to get married now is 26, and the average age for men to get married is 28. And so if you think about that, 50 years ago, it was common for people to get married in their teens. So very unique to US culture that we are focusing on education and we're focusing on careers. And so when our focus drifts toward, I'm going to get my school finished and I'm going to get established in my job before I settle down with a family, we delay our marriage, and then of course our children as well. So, and what others can you think? If you had written down some others before I went through those, please feel free to talk about those in your post. So dominant culture. I want to talk a little bit about that because that is important to be aware of. Now, specifically, we can talk about dominant US culture.